No one walks into a recovery room believing that it will be the last room they ever see. In the minds of every patient, the danger ends when the surgeon ties the final stitch, the anesthesia fades, and the painful chapter is supposed to close. But for these stars, the moment that should have brought relief instead delivered unthinkable tragedy, as breaths slowed, hearts faltered, and eyes that were meant to open again slipped permanently into silence. 15 names, 15 lives, 15 stories where the scalpel didn't end the danger, but opened the door to an irreversible stillness, beginning with the voice Hollywood once believed could never, ever go quiet. Joan Rivers. Joan, the razor-tongued queen of comedy, the woman who built an empire with wit so sharp it could cut through steel, never feared the operating table. She had joked about it, embraced it, and lived half her life under its lights, lifting, tucking, refreshing, reinventing. But on a calm September morning in 2014, she wasn't chasing beauty, she wasn't altering her face, she wasn't doing anything risky. She was simply undergoing a small throat procedure, a check, a scope, a routine evaluation that should have lasted minutes and ended with her cracking jokes and recovery. She walked into the Manhattan clinic, laughing with the staff, full of energy, full of life, still planning her next shows, still carrying the fire that kept her relevant for half a century. But once the anesthesia drifted into her bloodstream, her oxygen levels plummeted, alarms screamed, her heart staggered, and panic ripped through the room. Yet the woman who had survived the brutal sexism of early comedy, the betrayals of late-night television, the crushing pressures of Hollywood, and the tragedies of her personal life, never woke up again. At 81, she was unstoppable, booked, busy, brilliant. But the simple failure of a clinic stole her voice in seconds. Melissa Rivers, her daughter, filed a malpractice lawsuit not for revenge, but out of heartbreak, asking how her mother, surrounded by professionals, could slip away unnoticed, unprotected, and unheard. Joan Rivers wasn't just a comedian, she was a survivor, a trailblazer, a woman who clawed her way into spaces where women weren't welcome, who refused to age quietly or politely, who turned pain into power and heartbreak into punchlines. And yet, in the end, it wasn't her age that silenced her. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't exhaustion or time. It was a missed breath, a single overlooked moment, a curtain descending before she ever delivered her final joke. And then came another tragedy. Number 2, Donda West. She wasn't a celebrity by Hollywood standards, but she was the heartbeat behind one of the loudest and most before the cameras, before the fame, before the global tours. She was a professor, an intellectual force, a writer and a mother who believed fiercely in her son's brilliance. And as Kanye's star rose, she moved into his orbit, becoming a quiet but steady part of the world of flashing lights. When she chose to undergo cosmetic procedures in 2007, a breast reduction and tummy tuck, it wasn't vanity but comfort, wanting her body to match the pace and pressure of the life she was now living. The surgeries were performed on November 9th, and she was discharged the next day with instructions to rest at home. But within hours she felt pain tighten around her chest, struggled to breathe, and collapsed as her family panicked around her. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital. But the woman who had raised Kanye West from boyhood to superstardom, who shaped his confidence and fueled his ambition, never regained consciousness. She was only 58. The official explanation cited underlying heart disease and post-surgical complications, but none of those words eased the devastation that followed. Kanye spiraled into grief so deep it permanently altered his music, his worldview, and his public identity. Donda West had walked into surgery believing she'd return home, believing she'd wake up refreshed, believing she'd live the next chapter of her life with her son. But somewhere between anesthesia and recovery, something went wrong, and she too slipped away before she ever had the chance to heal. Then came number 3, Olivia Goldsmith, the best-selling author whose novels transformed heartbreak into revenge, pain into empowerment, and silence into roar. Her book, The First Wives Club, became a cultural milestone, a sharp, brilliant dissection of women discarded by men, by youth, by Hollywood itself. But Olivia knew reinvention intimately, and in 2004, at 54 years old, she decided to undergo a minor cosmetic procedure to tighten the skin along her jawline. A small change, a routine surgery, the kind thousands undergo every year without a second thought. She checked into a respected Manhattan clinic, underwent the usual preoperative steps, and was given general anesthesia before the surgeon even entered the room. Yet before any scalpel could touch her skin, her heart abruptly stopped. No incision, no cuts, no surgical movement, just anesthesia, a sudden reaction, and immediate cardiac arrest. She fell into a coma, never waking, never knowing what happened, never hearing the uproar her death would cause. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Olivia Goldsmith, who had written so powerfully about reinvention, never received her own second chance. Her passing sparked fierce debates about the safety of anesthesia, the protocols of outpatient clinics, and she had gone in seeking confidence, comfort, renewal, yet died under sedation, in the very room meant to restore her. And in these three stories, Joan Rivers, Donda West, Olivia Goldsmith, we see the same tragic thread. No one expects to die in recovery. No one expects the scalpel to be the beginning instead of the end. And no one expects a moment designed to heal to become the moment where everything stops forever. 15 stars, 15 tragedies, 15 echoes of the same haunting truth. The most dangerous part of surgery is often the part no one warns you about. The silence after the operation, when the world thinks the danger is gone, but fate, unseen and uninvited, decides otherwise. And like so many of the women she wrote about, strong, funny, imperfect, fighting battles no one else could see, Olivia Goldsmith deserved years she never got, a future she had already begun planning. But life doesn't always honor the stories we think we're still writing, just as it didn't honor the bright, trembling flame of Tammy Faye Bakker, whose smile tried to outshine the storms she carried. Tammy Faye was impossible to ignore, a walking burst of color and conviction. Her mascara-thick lashes, trembling vibrato, and unwavering faith making her not just a television figure, but an entire era of American religious culture wrapped into one glittering, unpredictable human being. As co-host of the PTL Club with her husband Jim Bakker, she became the beating heart of televangelism in the 1980s. Emotional, flamboyant, larger than life, but behind the rhinestones, behind the tears, behind the glittering image of a woman who always seemed too much, was someone quietly fighting to hold on to dignity while the world mocked her, while the empire she helped build collapsed in scandal, bankruptcy, and humiliation. After PTL fell, she endured the kind of public ridicule that would have crushed anyone else, but Tammy kept showing up, laughing, crying, praying, singing, until cancer arrived, first in the colon, then spreading to her lungs, stealing her weight, her breath, her strength, but never her courage. Even in her final weeks, weighing less than 70 pounds, her eyes barely open, she appeared on television one last time, voice trembling but heart blazing with hope, faith, and a determination to smile through the pain. She underwent procedures near the end, interventions meant to ease her breathing and extend her time. Treatments that brought sedation and strain her body could no longer fight through, and she never fully recovered. In July 2007, she passed away at home, holding her husband's hand, unable to speak, leaving behind a legacy that was far larger than the caricature people once drew of her. Tammy Faye died the way she lived, full of faith, wrapped in love, still trying to smile, even as that smile faded gently into silence. And then came Bobby Darin, the man whose rhythm couldn't restart. Bobby lived like someone racing a clock he knew was ticking faster than everyone else's. Born with a damaged heart, thanks to childhood rheumatic fever, he carried a secret expiration date into every studio and onto every stage. Yet he burned with ambition, jumping from rock to swing, from splish splash to Mac the Knife, earning Grammys, movie roles, and a rare kind of respect seldom given to young stars. But beneath the smooth voice and electric presence was a heart cracking under the pressure of time. In 1973, at just 37, Bobby Darin underwent open-heart surgery to repair a failing valve. It wasn't his first, and doctors knew the risks, but Bobby pushed forward. He had more to sing, more to live, dreams he refused to surrender. The surgery seemed successful, but in recovery, his oxygen levels faltered, his heart weakened, and his brain was deprived of the blood flow it desperately needed. He never woke up again. In hours, the man who once lit up every stage with desperate, beautiful urgency slipped into the stillness he had feared all his life, leaving behind music that felt even more fragile once the man behind it was gone. And then, the woman who had been America's mother, Florence Henderson, followed a similar fate of quiet departure. Florence was not just an actress, she was comfort, stability, a symbol of a gentler, safer world through her role as Carol Brady on The Brady Bunch. Off-screen, she carried the same warmth. She laughed easily, worked tirelessly, and showed kindness wherever she went. Even in her 80s, she remained active, attending shows, cheering on cast members, staying present in a world that adored her. But late in 2016, she reportedly underwent a minor medical procedure, nothing dramatic, just routine maintenance, the kind most people handle without fear. Days later, she appeared on Dancing with the Stars, vibrant as ever, smiling for the cameras. But something happened in the hours that followed, whether a hidden reaction, a complication, or simply her heart deciding it had given the world enough. Florence Henderson died suddenly on November 24, 2016 at 82 years old. No build-up, no dramatic warnings, just a quiet end to a life that had gently shaped millions. Her passing didn't create frenzy, just a soft ache across generations who felt like they'd lost a member of their own family. She slipped away in stillness, the same way she brought calm to others for decades. And then, as the art world held its breath, the night grew even heavier with the loss of Andy Warhol, the man who turned soup cans into icons, celebrities into philosophy, silence into spectacle. Warhol had always lived on the edges of life, observing, absorbing, transforming, but even he couldn't escape the danger that lurks after the scalpel. In 1987, following a routine gallbladder procedure, complications spiraled silently in the night, and the artist, whose studio never slept, whose ideas never stopped, whose influence reshaped culture itself, closed his eyes and never reopened them, turning the bright hum of his world into an unexpected and permanent quiet. And these stories, Tammy Faye, Bobby Darin, Florence Henderson, Andy Warhol, remind us again that no matter how bright someone's public life burns, no matter how iconic their legacy, no matter how routine the surgery seems, the moment between sedation and recovery is one of the most fragile borders a human can cross. It is a threshold where laughter, fame, brilliance, and hope can be lost in a single breath, leaving behind only echoes, memories, and the haunting truth that sometimes the danger begins right when the world believes it has safely ended. Andy Warhol didn't just create art, he reshaped the very definition of fame, turning celebrity into a canvas and turning culture into a performance. His silver wigs, quiet stare, and neon-soaked factory transforming the world into something strange, mesmerizing, and entirely new. Yet behind the flat affect and deliberate detachment lived a man whose body had been carrying pain and trauma ever since the day Valerie Solanas shot him in 1968, ripping through his organs, forcing surgeons to literally bring him back from the dead, leaving him scarred, fragile, and never truly whole again. Decades later, in early 1987, when doctors told him he needed gallbladder surgery, he hesitated, not because he feared pain, but because he had lived most of his adult life knowing his body wasn't the same as everyone else's, knowing one wrong move could reopen the ghosts of the past. Eventually he agreed, believing it was routine, simple, fixable. The operation was a technical success, but the morning after, in the quiet antiseptic calm of a New York hospital room, Warhol went still. No alarms, no frantic shouts, just a sudden cardiac arrest, and the man who had survived bullets, satire, and fame's darkest shadows slipped away in silence. Shocking, the art world that assumed immortality had somehow been written into his contract with the universe. And just when the world began processing that loss, another gentle soul was quietly slipping. But Bixby's personal life held a kind of heartbreak that would have crushed a lesser man, losing his young son to a sudden infection, then losing his ex-wife to suicide, pain that hollowed rooms and slowed breath. Yet somehow he kept acting, kept directing, kept showing up long after the world expected him to fall apart. When prostate cancer struck in the early 1990s, Bill fought it quietly, privately, determined to work through it the same way he faced every crisis, with grace, dignity, and a refusal to burden anyone. He underwent treatments, medications, procedures meant to buy more time, but his body was exhausted, worn down not only by illness, but by years of quiet grief he never fully expressed. After one final medical intervention in November 1993, his body simply stopped responding, and Bill Bixby slipped into unconsciousness and never returned, dying at 59 with the same gentle silence he brought to every role. Then came Richard Mulligan, the man who could twist his face into 1,000 emotions and make audiences howl with laughter without saying a word. He wasn't the kind of Hollywood star who demanded attention, but he became the kind of television presence that felt like home, first in the irreverent chaos of soap, then in the warm, steady comfort of Empty Nest. Mulligan didn't crave fame, he craved work, craft, honesty, and he gave the medium decades of brilliance. But cancer came quietly in the late 1990s, creeping into his life the way whispers creep into memory, and he kept working as long as he could until doctors recommended a procedure to help manage complications. It wasn't dangerous, not life-threatening, not something anyone feared, but his body was tired, worn down by illness, and years of pushing through pain with a smile. After the treatment, he never fully woke, passing away on September 26, 2000, at age 67. His death wasn't a headline. It wasn't a trending moment. It was a soft exhale in a world too busy to notice that one of its quietest geniuses had left the stage. And then we look back further to a woman whose brilliance was so blinding the industry didn't know how to hold her. Dorothy Dandridge, the woman who broke a barrier simply by being herself. In 1954, when she became the first black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, she didn't just walk into Hollywood history, she cracked the institution open. She was elegance, skill, depth, vulnerability, fire. But behind that luminous presence was a life filled with obstacles the industry refused to help her overcome. Dorothy was boxed in, pushed out, typecast, cornered by financial troubles, romantic disappointments, and the unbearable. The coroner ruled it a combination of an embolism and complications from medication. Another star gone, not during the danger of surgery, but in the deceptive quiet after, in that fragile moment when the world expects recovery, not tragedy. Dorothy's spotlight never stayed on long enough for her to reclaim her life. She died alone, without applause, without fanfare, without the recognition she deserved, leaving behind a legacy the world only fully appreciated decades too late. And as we look at the stories of Warhol, Bixby, Mulligan, and Dandridge, four souls who shaped film, art, television, and culture, it becomes painfully clear that death in the aftermath of surgery or treatment is not always loud, not always dramatic, not always expected. Sometimes it's quiet, clinical, hidden behind hospital curtains, or wrapped inside a moment of solitude. These people trusted the process. They trusted healing. They trusted time. They believed they'd wake up tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. And what remains are the legacies they left behind: unfinished jokes, unpainted canvases, unfilmed scenes, unwritten chapters, memories preserved not in the moment they died, but in the vibrant, complicated, breathtaking moments when they lived. Dorothy Dandridge was elegance, talent, fragility, and defiance wrapped into one impossibly radiant figure, a woman whose mere presence altered the energy of any room she stepped into, yet Hollywood, blind, limited, and terrified of change, never gave her the stage she deserved. After the explosive brilliance of Carmen Jones, a performance so mesmerizing it made the entire industry stop and question its own boundaries, the roles that should have followed never came. Instead of the strong, complex leading characters she had earned, Dorothy was offered maids, mistresses, and nameless background silhouettes meant to decorate other people's stories. Roles so beneath her artistry they felt like insults disguised as opportunities. She refused them again and again because she knew her worth, but that refusal came with a cost. A brutal financial decline that left her fighting just to survive as doors slammed shut simply because the system wasn't ready to celebrate a black woman with that much fire, depth, and intelligence. By the early 1960s, her finances were unraveling, her health was fragile, and the same shimmering grace that once lit up nightclubs and film sets now struggled to navigate a world that had moved on without ever truly embracing her. In 1965, after sustaining a foot fracture, Dorothy reportedly underwent medical treatment. Some say cortisone injections, others whisper about complications related to her injury. And whatever the source, something unseen formed inside her, something small and silent. On September 8, 1965, the world found Dorothy Dandridge lifeless in her Los Angeles apartment at just 42 years old. The official cause was a fat embolism, but to those who adored her, her death felt like the final chapter in a long story of erasure, not by illness, but by an industry that never allowed her the room to breathe, to expand, to reign the way she was meant to. She died in solitude, in a country she had tried to transform with nothing more than talent and dignity, a woman who deserved novels and got footnotes. And while her light dimmed far too soon, another star was fading quietly in her own way. Karen Carpenter, the woman whose voice felt like a soft breath pressed against the edge of loneliness. The singer who sounded as though she were afraid to wake the world even as she broke its heart. Karen sang with a kind of intimate ache that made every lyric feel like a confession whispered at midnight. With her brother Richard, she created songs that wrapped themselves around people's memories, songs that felt like gentle hands on wounded hearts. But behind the sweetness was a war she fought alone, anorexia nervosa, at a time when the world barely recognized it as an illness, much less a crisis. Her weight fell, her heart weakened, and still she smiled. Still she performed. Still she tried to reassure everyone that she was fine. She entered treatment in early 1983 and began to gain weight again, giving her family hope that she was finally pulling herself back from the edge. But her body, weakened by years of starvation, couldn't keep up with her spirit. On the morning of February 4th, Karen collapsed in her parents' home. The paramedics tried to revive her, but refeeding syndrome had already taken what little strength remained in her heart. She was only 32. She didn't die on stage. She didn't die in despair. She died in the heartbreaking space between suffering and recovery, in a moment when hope had just begun to bloom. As her voice echoes through the years, soft, pure, impossible to replace, it feels like she still exists in some quiet corridor of memory, singing to a world that still misses her. And then there was Henry Fonda, Hollywood's embodiment of quiet moral authority, who never needed to raise his voice or widen his stance to command a room. He was the man standing at the back of a courtroom in 12 Angry Men, the wandering conscience of The Grapes of Wrath, a still point in a chaotic world. A performer whose honesty felt carved out of the American landscape itself. Off-screen, he was private, disciplined, steady, a man who carried himself like a whisper rather than a shout. But the operation came and went quietly, like the man himself. But afterwards, Henry Fonda never fully recovered. His body slipped into weakness and never found its way back. He died on August 12, 1982, at 77 years old. His departure a soft disappearance rather than a dramatic spectacle. It felt like the final fade-out in a film that didn't need music to break your heart. And finally, Karen Black, the dreamer with the wide, searching eyes, the actress whose face never belonged to one era or one genre, the woman who drifted through 1970s cinema like a strange, restless spirit. She wasn't neat, she wasn't predictable, and she didn't fit into any Hollywood box. That's exactly why people loved her. Her performances in 5 Easy Pieces, Easy Rider, and The Great Gatsby made her unforgettable, a kind of cinematic wildfire that refused to burn the same way twice. But behind the dreamer's imagination lived a woman who was quietly fighting for her life after being diagnosed with cancer in the early 2010s. She tried treatments, alternative therapies, hopeful experiments, and spiritual paths. But the disease continued stealing pieces of her strength. In August 2013, after undergoing procedures meant to manage her pain and extend her time, her body simply couldn't recover. Karen Black died at 74, not with the flourish of her early roles, but in the soft surrender of a woman whose dreams had outlived her strength. She slipped away as mystically as she lived, one last unfinished story in a career full of roles that never quite touched the ground. Dorothy, Karen Carpenter, Henry Fonda, Karen Black, 4 souls who shaped film, music, and culture in ways the world still feels. Each carried their own kind of quiet brilliance, and each left the world in the space after treatment, after hope, after the moment when healing was supposed to begin. And in the end, their stories remind us that sometimes the most devastating endings come not during the storm, but in the fragile stillness that follows. Wild, magnetic, and impossible to pin down, Karen Black moved through Hollywood like a restless flame that refused to burn the way anyone expected, starring in 5 Easy Pieces, The Great Gatsby, Nashville, and a long list of films where she carved out a niche as the unpredictable heartbeat of New Hollywood, a performer whose very presence hinted at something rawer and more dangerous than the polished roles of her time could contain. Yet, even as her career shifted, by 2010, the woman who had once seemed untouchable began to feel the weight of an enemy she could not outact or outrun. What she believed to be simple back pain revealed itself as ampullary cancer, a rare and vicious disease hiding where the pancreas and small intestine meet, and Karen, always fearless, stepped into the fight with the same strange bravery she had offered every role. Surgery followed, major, life-altering operations that removed parts of her pancreas and intestines, leaving her weakened, physically drained, and yet still astonishingly hopeful as she explored alternative treatments, leaned on fundraising campaigns, and wrote openly about her condition with a vulnerability that stunned even those who had admired her for decades. But no matter how fiercely she fought, the illness tightened its grip, her voice faded, her strength dimmed, and in her final months, she lived inside a quiet decline that even she could not transform into art. On August 8, 2013, at the age of 74, Karen Black slipped away after years of surgeries, hospitals, therapies, and the long private war that ultimately claimed her, not in a blaze of Hollywood glamour, but in stillness, in a silence that felt too small for someone who had lived so loudly with feeling. She didn't get the glossy ending Hollywood gives its chosen ones, but then again she never needed it, because Karen Black's story was never about fame, it was about emotion, raw, trembling, honest emotion, and that she gave the world without ever holding back. And then there was Lane Smith, a man who never needed noise or spotlight tricks to make himself unforgettable. He was the stern coach in The Mighty Ducks, the sharp-tongued attorney in My Cousin Vinny, the commanding Perry White in Lois and Clark, and 100 other faces that lived quietly yet indelibly in American memory. He was never the star in the headline sense, but he was the soul of everything he touched, the kind of actor who made scenes feel fuller simply by being in them. While he made generations laugh, think, and believe, his final years told another story, one marked by ALS, the slow, cruel paralysis that traps a man inside his own body while leaving his mind painfully aware. There were whispered procedures, interventions meant to slow the decline, and one of them, just one attempt at relief, pushed his fragile body too far. Afterward, Lane sank into a deteriorating state he never emerged from. He died at home in Northridge, California, and though they called it peaceful, peace rarely arrives cleanly. Sometimes it is merely the last quiet breath after a long fight no one could see. No headlines, no farewell tours, no Hollywood frenzy, just the soft disappearance of a man who had spent his whole life supporting the story until his own slipped gently out of the frame. And then there was... Bill wasn't the kind of actor who needed explosions or speeches to stand out. He had a rare warmth that made him feel familiar even to strangers. Whether he was the loyal soldier in Aliens, the cowboy in Tombstone, the eccentric explorer in Titanic, or the father fighting demons in Frailty, he played every role with an honesty that made audiences trust him instantly. But Paxton carried something inside him most people never saw, a damaged aortic valve, a quiet threat he had lived with for years. In 2017, he finally underwent surgery to repair it. A dangerous operation, yes, but a necessary one, the kind of procedure people survive every day. He came out of the first surgery alive, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt back towards safety. But days later, everything spiraled. A stroke triggered by post-operative bleeding sent his body into a crisis doctors couldn't reverse. They tried, but time had already closed its fist. On February 25, 2017, Bill Paxton died at 61, leaving colleagues stunned, fans grief-stricken, and Hollywood blindsided by the sudden disappearance of one of its most quietly beloved actors. His family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, not out of theatrics, but out of heartbreak, citing negligence and unnecessary risks. Yet no settlement could bring him back. What remained were his characters, the ones who braved tornadoes, haunted ships, vampire towns, and alien planets with equal conviction. Bill Paxton didn't die on a set drenched in drama. He died in a hospital room, in the place where relief was supposed to begin. in a silence that felt impossible for a man so full of life. And that is the heartbreak that ties all these stories together. Karen Black, walking into surgery again and again with faith in her chest. Lane Smith, submitting to one more medical procedure hoping for ease. Bill Paxton, lying under hospital lights trusting that science would hold him. None of them knowing their final chapter had already begun. They weren't chasing fame or beauty or immortality. They were chasing relief, comfort, breath, time. They walked into hospitals expecting healing. Instead, anesthesia settled in, monitors hummed, breaths slowed, and the curtain never rose again. In Hollywood, the final scene rarely goes as written. Sometimes the quietest endings belong to the brightest lights. And perhaps the only mercy in all this is that none of them knew the credits were about to roll.